Okay, I'm Barbara Garrity-Blake, and it's November 12th, 2009, and I'm talking to Mr. William Anson Davis at his house here in Beaufort. So, William, why don't we start off with you telling us where you were born and what community did you grow up in?
I was born in Gloucester and grew up there. Born in 1937.
My hometown.
Yes.
I keep forgetting that. That's great. So how did you first get involved in the menhaden industry?
Well, I was working at the airport to get my commercial license, and the fish spotters came in the fall of the year, and it was about 25 planes would come. We'd gas them up and oil them up, and I got to know all the fish spotters and the chief pilots, and that's how I got my job. They were short a pilot, and I had done a favor for one of the chief pilots, and I asked him to consider me, and he said he would. He was going to try to get a trained pilot, fish spotter, but if he couldn't find someone that like he was happy with, he would consider me and train me. And in January of 1969, he called me and told me I had the job and that we would start fishing the last Monday in May of that year. And 2 weeks before, we'd have a meeting in Reedville, Virginia, for the fish spotters and boat captains and the company managers. And that was the beginning.
Oh, so your first job was flying up on the Chesapeake Bay?
Yes, about 10 years.
So what was that like?
That was like a madhouse. That was the military jets, the commercial airliners, and the fish spotters all mingled together.
Oh my gosh. In
visibility that was barely 3 miles, and you could only see the water straight down in most haze you ever seen. Chesapeake Bay is known for the hazy spot.
Mm-hmm.
And I was glad to get back home. I came back home in 1978 and started working for Beaufort Fisheries. And I worked 1 year prior to coming back. I worked 1970 back here. We worked on contract, and I had a contract for 1 year, and they picked another pilot that had gone back with Smith that had worked with them before, and he worked 1 year and went left again, and so it was the deal was made that I would work the first year, train me, work 1 year, and then possibly the second year. But then I came back and worked for Beaufort Fisheries. They lost their pilot, Steve Oakley. He went down in Mississippi, and I came back in 70. We had a real good year that year, and they had the old wooden minesweepers at Beaufort Fisheries, then the Lynn and the Pauline.
Mm-hmm.
Then 1971, I went back to Chesapeake Bay. They wanted me back again, so I left. They offered me so much money I couldn't refuse.
Oh.
So I went back with them, and I was up there for the balance of the time.
Okay. Now you mentioned chief pilots.
Yeah, each company has a chief pilot. Jewel told me I was the chief pilot, but that was about it in word. Because a chief pilot just sort of tells the other planes which way to go. If they probably know, they'll ask sometime, and they'd rather for the chief pilot tell them to go one direction. If it's bad, then he gets to blame if they don't catch any fish or whatever. But he gets to patrol on Sunday, the patrol report. Everybody patrols Sunday about 4 hours, and planes go north and planes go south. I would go south down to Frying Pan Shoal. Other planes would go to Delaware, New Jersey, and we'd all come back to Chesapeake Bay or Beaufort or wherever we were flying out of at the end of the patrol and put the report. And we passed the report on from both companies. So both companies had the equal chance. We give us more coverage that way. We knew about more fish located in different areas of Chesapeake Bay, and then Chincoteague, Virginia, and then Maryland, Delaware, Rehoboth Beach, wherever they was located. And
so both companies at the time was Standard and Zapata Haney.
When I started, that was it. They owned Standard Products had a plant at Southport, and one at Moss Point, Mississippi, and one at Beaufort, and one at Reedville, Virginia, or across the creek, place called Fairport. It's like looking from Gloucester to Marshallburg across the creek. That's about the same thing.
Okay.
And the plant was at Fairport, and the Haney plant was in Reedville.
So the companies work together as far as the spotting of the fish?
Only the spotting. That's where it ended. That wasn't that way. But later years, that all the boats seemed to kind of congregate in one area, and the captains talked all Sunday afternoon, Sunday night, back and forth, and so everybody kind of knew what was going on. So we decided to get together and work out the deal where we could pass on and we do it in the air. We'd call out our report, and the people that was patrolling, it'd be several on a patrol, maybe 3 from each company, and we'd pass on the fish report, and it would be posted at a location at the airport or the fish factory. So
even at the airport, you'd put a fish report?
Yeah, and they'd drive out there, the captains would, and check the fish report before they went to the boat that night. Sunday afternoon or Sunday night.
Do you have any fish reports from times past?
No, I mostly mine when I came to Beaufort. I would call Bobo up because he was the only captain that I fished for at the time. He was the outside boat, and that was my primary duty.
Oh, so you could just tell him
I just tell
verbally.
him, right. And I would get all kinds of calls from all the crew members wanting to know where we were going, and some of them would be out of town, and they would call me to see where the fish report was and where the boat was going, so they'd know what time they'd have to be to the boat. Because in order to be to Southport, you had to leave at midnight to run those boats doing 12, 13 mile an hour. Had to run 100 miles. A little further than that, run through the slough at Frying Pan Shoal, and then back up in what they call the mud hole, which is the mouth of the Cape Fear River. That's where they start fishing. And Bobo would be out looking when I'd get there. I'd have 100 miles to fly. I'd take off, because if I'd had competition, I would have flown out of Southport and got a motel room, but transportation back and forth to the airport, sometimes they'd have a rental car, sometimes they wouldn't. But then we fished as far south as Georgia, and I'd stay at Hilton Head, South Carolina, airport there, little airport, Hilton Head. Oh yeah. And fly out there.
So what do you mean Bobo would be already out looking on the boat?
He'd be out. He'd be up and looking for the fish. When I got there, sometimes he would, if they were showing real good around Ballhead Island, I've seen him. I'd call him and he wouldn't answer me, and I knew something was going on. And I'd get there and he'd find the fish himself. When they show real good color and big nice fish, they're whipping. They whip the water with their tails, and just that's Menhaden's trait. They whipping all the time when they're swimming, and he would be on a set sometimes by himself. Once in a while he would do that. Then most of the time he'd be waiting for me to find him something.
Okay, so you had already given him the fish report, and so he'd know, okay, we're going to leave the dock at midnight, we're going to head for Southport, and then when you were ready the next morning to fly, he would already be out there.
He'd be up at daybreak. I'd take off an hour probably before it got light. in the dark and fly down there.
Okay.
That is, if I didn't have any thunderstorms and stuff like that. Sometimes we'd get chased around by thunderstorms. In the summertime, they come off the land. I've had to land several times to wait out a thunderstorm at Wilmington.
Well, in the larger companies, when there was a chief pilot and then several other pilots, did every vessel have their own spotter pilot? How'd that work, William?
No, it was standard products. We had 10 boats the first year that I flew. We had 10 boats and we had 6 pilots. Standard products had 6 pilots, and Haney products, which would later become Zapata, had 7. So that's how many the total planes, the 13 planes on Chesapeake Bay, that was covering the whole bay. And we'd take off morning and the boat would start reporting in. Some would say York River, some would say Mobjack Bay, some would say Pianki Tank, and some would say I'm over here in Chrisville. That was Tangier Sound or Tangier Island. They'd report in, and the ones taking off out of Reedville would go straight across to Tangier Island and across the firing range. They had ships that the military fired on, and they wouldn't get started until daylight, and we'd take off, and the ones that was taking off at Reedville would say, I got Tangier Sound, and I'd take off at Hummel, and some coming out of Norfolk would take on that lower bay. So we had them covered pretty quick. We'd be to them in 10-15 minutes.
Okay. So you could set a couple vessels at once as a spotter pilot?
Well, you'd be dropping one off and telling him if he didn't get on the fish and sink the fish. You had a lot of things. You could be a hero or a zero, and whichever worked out for you, because the boats would come ahead on the engines and sink the fish. And if you were with a Haney Products crowd, some of them would want to think they could save the fish for a later set, and they'd sink your fish if you was close by them. So you had to work every angle in the world to.
What do you mean sink the fish?
They'd come ahead on their steamer, and the noise of the wheel would cause the fish to settle away, and you couldn't see them.
Oh.
And you couldn't set on them, and they'd think after they got their set, they'd pop back up if they didn't separate, go out of the school.
So did some captains then want to sink the fish?
Well, the captains, I wasn't there, I couldn't tell you, but I know certain pilots, the pilots that handled the boat while the captain was aboard the first boat fishing.
I gotcha.
The pilots would do that. They would come on your channel. We set nets with CBs. We had a business band radio that was the main radio. We'd drop off, and they'd come up on. They say, "I'll be on your channel," which everybody had a designated channel. Mine was 14, and we were right over the boat. So CBs was the ideal situation, because if you had people talking on the CB from different areas, when you keyed the mic, your captain could hear you because you had the most power right there over his head. But those other companies would key the mic on you and let you run over your fish a lot of times. So it was all kinds of, it was like a baseball team playing another team. Everybody was working for their team trying to catch the most fish, you know.
So if I was the captain, I'm getting ready to make a set, it would be a strategy to get a bunch of fish to sink, and then after we made the set, we could come back later.
After you got through pumping that first set, then the boat would leave because he couldn't see the fish to set on. He might go to another area, and the fish pop back up, and the captain get ready to go. He'd drop right off and set on them.
Oh, so you'd want to sink the fish so other boats couldn't get them.
Yeah, I mean, now I wouldn't do that. I would tell my captain, the pilot in the boat, to hold still, because they were trying to get a set next to him, you know. And I'd call the pilot, whoever it was, Tommy or Bill or whoever the pilot was, and say, how about holding your steamer there, Cap? Tell this guy's coming up on your stern can get a set right over your bow. He'd say, okay, I'll be right still. Because he'd say, now, sometimes the fish were breaking up in the net and they were trying to sink the corks. And you knew he had to watch his net. And what they could do, if they was pointing towards the corks, they could back down on the steamer and make those corks come up. Make the fish back away from the corks when they were bearing down on them, you know.
Right. That's interesting.
It's all in a day's work. It's so many things that happens you could never get it all on tape or wrote down.
I know.
The things that happen.
Well, William, so could you just describe in a nutshell what was the job of a spotter pilot?
My job was to find the fish, to give the boats a report, and you had to be careful to not what we call blow the fish report up, make it larger than it actually was, or call them. You had to be trained to a point that you could look at the fish and tell what you were looking at. They can be the same size, but the color, the amount of whips, the shape of the edge of the fish, where it's defined or where it's watery looking, we used to call, determines the amount of fish that's in it. And the deep water. If you're in deep water, you got a good red color, defined edge, a lot of whips, you got a nice place to fish. If you're close to the beach, the redness is more of a black color, doesn't have that deep red looking. And the edge of the fish, you can't tell hardly where it ends or where it begins. And you don't have that many whips on it, chances are they won't turn out. When I say they won't turn out, there won't be enough because they want at least 100,000. Used to, they'd set on 25,000, and that 1,000 is 660 pounds per 1,000.
Oh.
So that's the 25,000 or 30,000. They didn't want to set on that, but they'd set on. If there wasn't anything around, they'd set on 50, and they would take 100 just about any time. But if they wouldn't take 100, they could run a little ways and get 200. So that's a nice set, 100 or 200,000. Mm-hmm. But I've seen Bobo pump 1.7 million.
In one set? You're kidding.
1,700,000, one set.
Oh my God.
And you're talking about tons of fish. Talking about way up in the tons, 70, 80, 90 tons of fish.
Where was that set?
He pumped that many, one set at Lockwood Folly Inlet below Southport, and one set we set on a mud raw. I took a chance on it, didn't see a whip, didn't see color, didn't see anything, just set on a mud raw. And it was a load of fish, it probably 10 million in that one bunch, and the color come out of the net while he broke a hole in the net while he was pumping, and the color come out and made another bunch of fish inshore. They got back together, and the color, you could see the color. I took pictures of it, and you could see the color going in, bunching up inshore in another bunch of fish.
What's a mud royal?
Well, it's a whirl, like a spot of mud coming up in a particular area, and there'd be a twist to it, a little whirl where they're going round and round, and they'll whirl that mud off the bottom. When you're in deep water off the Lockwood Folly Inlet, we was off the sea buoy, and they were mud roiling in possibly 75 feet of water. You talk about a nice bunch of fish.
Wow.
So, and that's the part I miss worse than the flying part, is the fish spotting part. It was a good job, made a good living. It was really what I wanted to do. I fell right into it.
Mm-hmm. So not only did you find the fish in the first place, then you played a role once they let down the purse boats, right?
We had to, when they got ready to go, they would call me on the radio and say, which way? And I'd say port side or starboard side. And when they was heading down the side, I'd say steady or come right or left. And when I had them pointing right over the fish, I'd say steady. And on Chesapeake Bay, when you were setting, you had a lot of current. You were setting, the fish was coming into the current, and you were setting downwind of the current. Mm-hmm. You were setting with the tide. Fish was working into the tide, coming towards you. So you had to be careful. The tide was sweeping you. The fish was coming towards you. So if you got too close to them, the net would go right over top of the fish. The fish, once the net comes out of the boat, has to settle in real deep water. It's heavy and it'll settle, but it has to have time to do it. So the boat, we judged, the boat of Gregory Poole was 190 feet. We judged at least one length of the boat and sometimes two. So you're talking about 350 feet opening up on the fish before you got to them. So they would come down between the purse boats when you got going around them, and you'd come together on the backside of the fish, and the net would be on the bottom before the fish hit it. If it didn't, they'd keep it up and go right under the bottom and keep on going. And the captain couldn't see them. Only thing, he might see some whips or so, but they all depended on you, most basically Chesapeake Bay area. Now the beach is a lot different. Sometime early in the morning, fish show color along the beach and be whipping, and a captain can get off and run along. He sees them from the big boat. He can get off and run along if he happens to be where the fish are. But that's where the fish spotter plays an important role, is the long traveling distance that they have to do. If he had to come out of Beaufort Bar and look along that beach, he'd be 2 or 3 days before he'd be into the fish if he had to look along, and there wouldn't be any fish from here to Southport. And that's the way it was for years. You wouldn't see any fish at all around the inlets between Morehead City and Wilmington and Southport area, and Frying Pan Shoals. You would travel that distance before you get into the fish. So a fish spotter played an important role in getting the boats where they need to be. They'd run all night and be there early in the morning ready to go fishing when I got there.
Wow. So when you spotted fish on Sunday, William, how did you know that they'd still be there the next day for the captain?
Well, that's where you could be a hero or a zero. You would sometimes, if they would run fish, when we call run fish, we talk about fish that come from another area that's traveling. They'll come to Frying Pan Shoals, and all of a sudden they'll be there one day, turn around and leave, and 2 days later they're in South Carolina. They didn't hang around, and we'd sometimes catch 1, 2 loads, sometimes 3 loads before they would disappear back across Little River Inlet, which is the line, North Carolina, South Carolina line at Little River, South Carolina. And that's just before you get to Myrtle Beach. Mm-hmm. You can see the hotels right on the other side of the inlet. We could fish up to that point.
But generally, these big, massive places of fish would still hang together?
Yeah, fall of the year is different altogether. That's when the bodies of fish, big, we call them bodies because it's sometimes 100 to 200 million fish in one area of fish. Just like that picture I have in there you've seen.
Yes.
The Gregory Poole would look like a dot compared to the huge bodies of fish. Yeah. And the Gregory Poole, like I say, is 190 feet long, and they were huge. And they were boiling mud off the bottom in over 100 feet of water. I didn't take the picture. Henry Dixon took the picture. He lives at Whitestone, Virginia, one of the fish spotters up there. He had his camera with him. He took the pictures, and he gave me one of the pictures. But the picture he took was of my boat.
Oh.
It was Bobo wasn't fishing it at the time. It was before Bobo came to Beaufort Fisheries. Bobo came to Beaufort Fisheries somewhere about 1979 or 80. I don't know which year. It's around that time. I wouldn't be off probably more than 1 year. But he was the best I ever fished with as far as doing things on his own. Innovation, like changing rings on the net, and not just taking it back to the net man at the factory and let him do it, but doing it himself. And one year, Harold Huntings came to Beaufort. He had a new net when he came, and Baba was beating him so bad, he said to Jewel, I need one of those nets, like one of those old nets like Baba was fishing. Baba called those old rotten nets he was fishing with. He got from Virginia, from Zapata. And Harold Jewel got him a net, and Harold put his new net on the shore. And Baba said, Harold, let me use that new net. He said, you're welcome to it. I can't do nothing with it. So Baba got it, changed the rings on the bottom of it, and caught 40 million with it that fall. Harold said he wore my net out.
Oh my gosh!
So it's been a lot of fun, a lot of excitement. And anybody's ever menhaden fished, the boys have been on trawlers and done every other kind of fishing, said it gets in your blood. It's the only fishing they've ever done that they just become part of them,
What, the menhaden?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Menhaden fishing.
So, William, have you ever been in a situation where a storm blew up, or you felt like maybe you were in danger?
That was just about every day.
Really?
Oh yeah. When you travel several hundred miles in a given day, you run into all kinds of weather. My wife would say, you're not taking off now, it's raining. I say, it won't be raining where I'm going. And I'd leave. If it wasn't raining so bad the visibility would cut down, you'd have to take off. And then we'd have fronts come through, and I'd come down as far as Cape Lookout, and the front would go from west of Beaufort right across Bogue Inlet, right on up across Drum Inlet, and be black as it could be, and I'd ride around waiting for the boats to get down, and get down to Cape Lookout, and the front would be getting close to me. The roll clouds was real black and angry looking, and I would slow my airplane down, put my flaps down, pull my seat belts, shoulder harnesses tight, and just drive underneath of it, and it would roll me and beat me and bang me, and I'd pop out on the other side. Just keep right on working.
Oh my gosh. Did you ever have to make an emergency landing on the beach?
I made an emergency landing at Southport. I was on a Sunday patrol, and the engine broke an exhaust valve, and I lost one cylinder. It was dead, and the engine was shaking so bad I had to pull the power back, and I landed at Southport. I was right off the end of runway 5, so I made a right turn and landed at Southport. And I also broke a magneto one time, but I didn't have to land right then. I flew it where I heard the clunk at Weems airstrip, but I didn't have any tools, so I went to Reedville. I flew it to Reedville, taking a chance it wasn't something, the engine was still running. But when I noticed I had lost 100 RPMs on takeoff that it didn't do. So I got to Reedville, and when I landed, oil was dripping out of the engine down on my wheel pant, and it had broken mag, had locked up and broke and fell off the engine, the magneto had. So up there you didn't have a repair facility. The closest thing was Norfolk or Patrick Henry, Newport News. So I had to change the mag, had to order one, have it shipped by UPS the next day, and I got it and put it on myself. Kept right on going.
Gosh. So, William, did the spotter pilots get a share of the catch, or did you get paid straight salary?
The ones in Virginia, we got a fish bonus, and was party with your salary. You got a fish bonus, and then that was added to your salary. on the total catch for the factory, all the boats was on your bonus. You got so many cents per 1,000.
Oh, that was nice.
Yeah, and then you got paid a separate check, which was no income tax taken out. They give you a 1099 form for the airplane,
Mm-hmm.
and you paid your taxes on it separate from your earnings, your salary earnings.
Oh, that was paying you for use of the airplane and
Right.
the fuel and all that.
Right, you bought your own fuel and your maintenance on the airplane. The early years, when the fish pond got started, and when I made the statement that it was a thankless job, I didn't get a chance to finish my story. It was at the meeting we had downtown. But the early years, the fish spotters was considered by some of the captains as just, I don't know what you would say, that how they thought about it, but they didn't like it because the company had hired fish spotters. The old-time captains was catching their fish from the masthead, from the crow's nest. And they was good. Some was better than others, and those real good captains could see better. Some could see fish, some couldn't. And so the ones that thought the fish good caught more fish, and naturally they didn't want somebody coming along and helping that captain that couldn't catch a lot of fish to beat them. And so it was a kind of a riff. And I remember Bill Edwards, he was up there fishing in Delaware when this was going on. The early years, Kurt Young, that furnished the airplanes for the pilots, and then some got airplanes on their own and started working for the company individually. The captain said, I don't want a fish spotter. They wanted to raise, and Harvey went to Harvey Smith, and Harvey said, let me check with the captains. So that's the way it was. He didn't do anything. He checked with his captain. So it sounded like they were the boss. So they said, well, we don't want fish spotter. The fish spotter's getting paid enough as it is, and they wouldn't give them a raise. So the fish spotters went on strike. And so one of the guys said, he told the captains, I'll take the lowest boat in the fleet at this time. And the slowest boat, and that was probably the reason he was the lowest boat. He was slowest because a lot of times fish was caught when he got there, after they all outran him.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy, Bill Edwards told me his name, and I can't think of it right now, but he said, I'll take the slowest boat and the lowest boat and make him the high boat of the year over you captains that don't have fish spotter. So they did. The fish spotter stayed on the ground, and the chief pilot, or the pilot that was there, took the low boat, and I think it was Captain Wiley Lewis at the time. I stand corrected to that, but anyway, he did it. He made him the high boat that year, and the slowest boat there made him the high boat that season. So it was, when I said that it was a thankless job, I was from the standpoint of the early years and developing what has become a something you can't do without now. They don't have crow's nest anymore, That's been done away with. And some people didn't like to get up that high. That is really high, and when the boat's in a swell, you talk about you're on the tip of a pole that's just swinging all over the place,
Oh my gosh.
So, and one thing, I used to love to talk to the old captains. In the bad rainy days, they would come by the pilot house inn where we flew out of Weems there, where I flew out, and we talked to them about the early days, and they tell you stories. They would tell me stories about, they said, William, you know who the first fish spotter was? I said, no. They said, the fish hawk. The bird, the fish hawk.
Oh, yeah.
They said they would go over on eastern shores, the captains would, early years, before they had the planes. And they would stay over there where they could watch the fish hawks nest. when the fish hawk got up out of the nest and started out in the Chesapeake Bay, they would follow him. They'd follow him, turn and follow him, and when he'd get out and spot the fish, and he'd start circling, and he'd fly a little bit and he'd circle, they'd lower their boats away, their purse boats, and get out ahead of the steamer, and the school of fish that he dove in, that's the one they would set on, because they said he always dove in the biggest place of fish. So it was amazing. A lot of things I'd pick up. Captain Mr. Nat Lewis, I used to sit at the mites and have coffee with him. He'd tell me stories about hauling slab wood down to the factory when they fired the boilers with slab wood with an ox cart. He died. He'd been dead 15 years, I reckon, and he was 90-something when he died. And he'd tell him about hauling slab wood and how much he got paid, 50 or 75 cents a day or something like that, and about cooking those big roast shad in a shovel. He'd take them and clean them and fillet them and put them in the furnace in those hot coals and broil those menhaden. He said they were delicious. They had a lot of oil. You don't want to cook them in your house, but he said they were delicious, and that's what he'd eat.
He'd eat that for lunch while he was working.
Yeah. All those little stories, that was kind of cute.
Yeah, what do they fire those boilers up with now?
Bunker C oil.
Oh.
Every year, Jewel was faced with the problem of every year they would change. The laws started, environmental laws was written in the 70s, and every January 1st, new laws went into effect. They'd been written for years, Mm-hmm. And it was just a progressive thing, and Jewel was faced with going from one number oil to a lighter oil, which cost more money, but it had less pollutants in it. Supposedly, they'd have scrubbers on the stacks to wash out the pollution.
Mm-hmm.
But the menhaden industry was getting squeezed from several different directions. But now, I've heard the prices of fish meal, the scrap, is real high. Real high. I mean, you take a boat, take something $1,500 a ton, finished product, and when the Gregory Pool came to the dock, it had 75 to 80 tons of finished product on it.
That's something, huh?
Yeah, they had more fish than that, but this is scrap, finished, dried, and not counting the oil. This was just the finished meal after it's ground into fish meal.
You mean that's what would come out of that little fish?
I think they got, well, that was more than that. The boat would carry close to 2 million, so it had 1.7 million, so it's about 70 tons per million of finished product. And Standard Products got 105 tons per million. The reason they did, it was a stinking process, but they took and put fish oil back on their scrap and turned it into it. Not fish oil, but fish solubles. That's the byproduct of the blood, the water that's run through centrifuges and brought down real thick and then sprayed over, and it's just an awful odor. But it's high in protein, and they made a lot of extra money doing that. They blend soybeans and things like that. Mm-hmm. Standard Products was right much of an innovator of a lot of these things.
So if there were a factory today, they'd be making some money, huh?
Oh yeah, yeah. And we've quit fishing in the signs here by Harkers Island Channel and all in there, and I hear the people putting out little nets to catch food fish is getting a lot of menhaden. They say places they coming back in a vengeance.
Yeah, and I imagine anybody that's flying up and down the coast sees those great places of fish, and nobody's fishing them much.
It's amazing how these fish migrate. George Edwards was the chief pilot for Standard Products. A couple years prior to me going to work with him, he went to work with Zapata or Haney Products, and he said he'd eat his Thanksgiving lunch every year. The boats would cut out in November. They would cut out for 2 weeks and to get their crews to come to Beaufort, because some crews didn't want to fish down here in the wintertime on account they were scared of the ocean and the weather, because it was dangerous, you know. Mm-hmm. But they would cut out and switch their crews, get their fall fishing crews, their nets mended, their boat hauled up at the railways, whatever they had to do, and get ready to go. And George would eat his Thanksgiving lunch and leave and head to Wimble Shoals down at I'm sure I might be wrong on the show, Wimble Shoal, but anyway, Avon Rodanthe area.
Oh yeah, I think that is Wimble Shoals.
Wimble Shoals there, and he said that's where the body of fish would be. They come inshore there, and sometimes you wouldn't see them all the way from Virginia till you got to Wimble Shoals, and there they would be, bodies of them, and the boats would get on their way. If they wasn't all the way ready, they'd be ready to go, and they would come down and start fishing on them. The next Monday, they would run from Virginia down, be ready to fish, and they'd carry their fish to Beaufort. Now the Zapata crowd it used to be Haney Products at the time, put out at Beaufort Fisheries. They had a contract, a 60-40 contract. I think they got 40 and Beaufort Fisheries got 60. Or it could have been the way around. I forget now, but they worked on 60-40 share. So they made a lot of money. Captain Manuel Haney told me one time that John Larry, that owned one of the shad boats that fished, independent ones that fished and put his fish out at Haney Products. Mm-hmm. He had a good summer, Manuel Haney had, and he offered him. This was back in 1955 or 56 or 57. They offered him, give him $10,000 to come down and fish the boat. And he offered him $10,000, and Manuel caught $10 million that fall. That was a good, just a fall, 6 weeks of work.
Yeah.
Back then. And that was like half $100,000 today, you know.
So they would get geared up in Reedville to come down south to here for the fall fishery, and you're saying that the fish were that clockwork, where that one captain could finish his Thanksgiving?
They show up.
And then he would get on his boat, and he knew that there they'd be? George
would give him a report. He'd fly to Beaufort and call back and give him a report, and he would fly out of Beaufort next day. The fish would probably be somewhere. That was the first of the fish. There'd be more fish coming in, and they'd be Avon, which is below Rodanthe.
Yeah.
Be Rodanthe, Avon, Hatteras Point, and they would start fishing then and fish continuously right on till the fish went just about the Frying Pan Shoals, the Southport. They'd fish right that far. So it would take them. Normally, I could track fish by the mile an hour. Like, they would move that way, that far. But when fish would come out of the core sound and get along the beach and mud roll, and those fish were scattered fish, they would travel fast. I mean, they'd outrun a purse boat just about. But normally they would travel a mile an hour, but the big bodies of fish would be slowed up a little bit. They would be spawning, because some of the pilots on the boat had said you could dip a bucket in the water and pull it up and it'd be full of eggs.
Oh my gosh.
Had already spawned. You could see it, the water just working alive with eggs.
No kidding. And what time of year was that, the fall?
Yeah, that was in late November, December.
So that's getting ready to happen right now.
Yeah, the fish should be showing up at when the fish had changed the dates a little bit, they changed their calendar, because I could find them the 15th, a little earlier. I could find them the 15th, anywhere from 12th to the 15th of November.
Mm-hmm.
So why is today?
Today is the 12th of November.
So they've been finding some signs along below Virginia Beach, down as far as Manteo area,
Mm-hmm.
Killdale Hill, Jockey's Ridge, along in there. Been seeing some signs that some of the fish that could have come out of the sign, but these big bodies of fish come from up Jersey, up there. They got roe in them. They're big fish. They're a different class of fish that you find coming out of Chesapeake Bay and all that. They smaller class of fish comes out of Chesapeake Bay.
Okay, so how do you keep up with what's going on now?
I have one of the fish spotters, a friend of mine. He comes by. He'll call me, and when he gets to Beaufort, and I'll take him to lunch or something like that. Give him some transportation. He keeps me up on what's going on, or someone tells me. It's amazing how the ones that's out of it now get phone calls from the other that still in the business, and talk to them over the weekend and stuff like that. It was the most enjoyable time was when I worked for Standard Products in the late 70s and 80s with Beaufort Fisheries, and changing over. I worked against my crowd that I used to work for, like one ball player playing for another team, and you always want to do the best and catch the most fish. I think Bobo was the first to ever catch over 70 million.
Gosh.
That's a lot of fish. And then the next year he caught 80 or something like that. So it's been a good time.
Do you remember your last set?
No, I don't remember it. I was helping James Starnes' crew in the sign down at Davis before our boats would start fishing, and I had a artery that partially blocked, and I had to have a stent put in it, and I required a 6-month waiting period.
Oh.
So I decided to go ahead. I was 62, and I decided to go ahead and retire.
Mm-hmm.
And but it come kind of all of a sudden.
So that was when Beaufort Fisheries was still open. And
Yeah, they worked about 2 more years after I retired.
Who was their pilot?
Brian Pickett.
That's right.
Brian flew with me some,
Mm-hmm.
and he's down at Moss Point, Mississippi, and works at flies for the same factory, not the same company. It's Mega Protein, same factory that Standard Products, my first company, owned. They own one there, like I said, one at Southport, one at Reedville, Virginia, one at Beaufort. So they could just about cover the fish wherever they were, but they would always like to catch these big fish in Beaufort. They made more money off of those. You'd be surprised. I had a man tell me one time that he worked with his dad in a grocery store.
Uh-huh.
And he made a living. He made a year's work selling burlap bags.
For what?
Excuse me.
Okay.
This fellow that he was a Moore here in town.
Uh-huh.
Worked for his daddy in the grocery business, and he would sell burlap bags to the fish companies that they put scrap in before they sold it late years in meal. They grind it, but the scrap was dried and sacked up, and they called it guana.
Oh yeah.
And he would sell burlap bags. They'd been used one time and washed and cleaned and bundled, and he would sell them to the companies. He told me that he made him a year's work selling those bags just in the 6 weeks they was here.
Gosh.
And the oil companies and everybody, just those boats, those Gregory Pool. That Gregory Pool would burn 75 to 100 gallons an hour, and that Coastal Mariner would burn 150 gallons an hour. And you'd be surprised at the money that brought into this area, small town.
Did you see that picture of the Coastal Mariner getting sunk for a
No,
reef?
I didn't. That's a shame.
Yeah, it is.
It's amazing. It's funny. They said the Gregory Pool was sunk up north, and the Coastal Mariner was sunk down off of Frying Pan Shoals.
Yeah.
Kind of funny.
I know.
Up north is where the Coastal Mariner came from. Up in Maine, I think.
Oh, really? Huh. So what do you think now about Beaufort now that there's no factory or industry here?
I don't know. I think with tourism, you get some money coming into the county from tourists, but I don't know how that affect that during this downturn of the economy.
Yeah.
You know, people have a tendency to not drive as much and stay home, save some money. So young people really don't have any place to work around here. They have to leave. Some nice jobs around, but they're limited.
Yeah. Yeah, and like you said, the price of meal is so high that some money could have been being made right now.
I've heard up to $1,500 a ton.
Oh my gosh, I remember when it was about 300 and something a ton.
Yeah, it was down real low, then it was up there around 800-900, close to 1,000 there. Some years, that's the trouble. When you're not shipping any meal, you got to store it. You have to pay those crew when they come in every week, and you're putting it in the warehouse, and it could catch a fire real easy. That scrap, if you don't turn it, keep it turned, will build up a heat and it'll catch a fire. And matter of fact, before it catches a fire, it'll lose its digestibility. The animals that eat it, the chickens can't get the nourishment out of it when it goes through a heat and turns to dust. They have a way of testing it to know if it's the percentage-wise of it loses percentage-wise, and they would send you a bill for the amount that it lost after you'd done sold it.
Really?
In the early years when Jewel first took over down there, they lost about $200,000 worth of scrap that got damaged because it wasn't turned enough.
Oh my gosh.
And Jewel knew this fellow that worked at Sea and Sign, and he used to do the analysis at Beaufort Fisheries, the oil and all this, and Jewel asked him what was the secret to it, and he said, don't stop turning it from the time it goes on the floor until it's cured. It's like curing hay. If it don't cure right, and put it in the barn, it'll catch fire, burn up.
Wow. So that had a lot of chemistry to it, didn't it?
Oh yeah. When Jewel took over Beaufort Fisheries and started turning the scrap continuously like that, he got reports from companies that bought his scrap that it was the best product on the market, because he turned it until it cured, and they ground it as they shipped it, so it laid in the warehouse in scrap form, with some bones and scales and meat particles, dried, and it had to be dry. When it comes to a dryer, it's damp, got a dampness to it, and they have to turn it. They shove it through grates in the floor, and the paddles would take it down overhead and come to an opening in where they had in the overhead. They could drop it anywhere they wanted it to, and they'd pick it up on one end of the building, drop it on the other end of the building. As it dropped, it'd sift down like that, and it would dry, and they turning it and working it and letting the air get to it and fans running, and it would cure.
What do you mean they processed it while it was being shipped?
I said they ground it when it was being shipped. They ran it through a 2-stage grinder and grind it from scrap to meal.
At the factory?
At the factory.
Oh, while it was being shipped to the...
When it's leaving, going aboard the tractor and trailer that carries it. For years, they had rail cars. They had their own track at Beaufort Fisheries. The train came right there and pushed the cars in. They loaded rail cars with fish scrap or fish meal. They ground it, but before then they sewed those sacks up. They had I don't know what happened to the sewing machine, the sewer that sewed those bags up. That they used to bag every bit of scrap that was sold in tow bags. That's where the guy was talking about. He made the money selling burlap bags, because all the companies sacked their scrap.
That's amazing, isn't it?
My first job was delivering groceries. I had a little job on the weekends. I delivered groceries down at Beaufort Fisheries.
To the cookhouse?
To the cookhouse. And I could go in there mornings, and the cook would say, "Have you had breakfast?" Most of the time I hadn't had breakfast. And he'd say, "I'll fix you up right here. Sit down." It would be big plates of bacon and ham and sausage, and he'd fry me a couple of eggs right quick and toast, and oh my gracious, they'd fix you right up. And on the boat, that's the only place I know people eat 3 times a day. They eat 3 times a day, and they have the best cooks in the business. Norman George told me one time, one of the top captains, I asked him how he kept a good crew. He said, having a top cook. He said, because they don't go with the man that catches the most fish a lot of times. They go with the one who's got the best cook. He said his cook cooked cakes and pies every day.
Wow. From
scratch. How about that?
Yeah.
Wore a white shirt, long sleeves. He was a dark black man, and he was an excellent. Norman called him a chef. Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of those old captains I worked with are done dead and gone. Yeah. Up north.
When you were delivering groceries to the cookhouse, was that to the one at Beaufort Fisheries?
Yeah, Beaufort Fisheries. That was the only one I delivered to. The other ones that didn't operate in the summer, they operate in the summertime. They had the little sign boats that would go out, the little wooden purse boats, and the little 65-foot Menhaden boat. That was a big boat for the sign.
So is that how it would be? They would fish the Sound in the summertime?
Fish the Sound in the summertime, and start fishing about late May, June, July, August. And then the Harrybacks would come. They would we'd catch some of them outside in the little boats. We got the Beaufort Inlet right close, because they had to tow their purse boats, and they get in a little swell. They get to beating and banging and break the stern of the big boat. It was wooden. They was all wooden. The first boat I remember that was steel was the Lennoxville, and Bill Edwards fished that. He was on the panel up that night. Bill Edwards is 80 years old now. He remember Bill. Bill was good captain.
So that's a different Bill Edwards than this fella here.
Yeah, Bill. Did I say Bill Edwards? Mm-hmm. It was Bill Lewis. I'm sorry.
Oh, Bill Lewis?
Bill Lewis was the captain of the Lynchville.
So he was the captain of the first steel boat?
It was the first steel boat Beaufort Fisheries had. Then the next one was the Gregory Poole. But it was built as a minesweeper, built in Charleston, South Carolina in 1950. And I understand that it was taken out for sea trials, tested, and then mothballed and never used. It was brand new when Beaufort Fisheries bought it. And Piggy Potter told me if he'd have combined the two bids, that he would have got 2 minesweepers and the Gregory Poole for $20,000. And the Gregory Poole, I was down there the day they took a fire axe and cut the rubberized coatings they had around the doors that sealed the doors, and they had these crystals hanging up, big bags of crystals hanging up for take the moisture out of the inside of the boat.
Really?
The only thing they took off the boat was the steering wheel, and Piggy Potter got that back. I think he found out who had that. Stirred up a ruckus. Probably they thought they were going to have some trouble, and they gave it back.
Oh my goodness!
I think one of the skipper of it had it as a souvenir.
Mm-hmm.
But it's over in the Sanitary Restaurant now, sitting there.
Oh, is it?
Below some pictures, I gave John Tunnell wanted some pictures about menhaden fishing, so I gave him some. Bobo on that big set I set him at Lockwood Folly. He had a lot on, but I had a camera I'd never took. Always had left my camera home for some reason, and I didn't get a lot of pictures. I got some nice ones, but not the ones that I could have gotten.
Right. So there was a cookhouse at Beaufort Fisheries and a cookhouse at Harvey Smith, but Harvey Smith shut down in the summertime. Harvey
Smith, they had cookhouses mostly everywhere. Harvey Smith's factory worked when every Tuesday night I had a Coast Guard reserve meeting, and I went in the reserve in 1955. I was 18. Coast Guard reserves, and we would be trying to get to Atlantic Beach Bridge or crossed it, and the draw would be up, and these menhaden boats, one right behind the other, loaded with fish, was going to where the college is now.
Oh.
That was Haney Products, and then Robert Taylor, that had a factory, sold to Standard Products, and Standard Products at one time had one there, and Wallace had one. George Wallace, his boats would come from down. At one time they had 60 boats, they said here. That was before my recollection, but would be in this county, would raise the population, because every one of those 60 boats had 17 to 22 men. Later years they had 17. Early years they pulled the net by hand. They had 22, 23 men.
Gosh.
That was a lot of income, and they all bought Christmas in Carteret County before they went home. Bought their stuff for Santa Claus, and so Beaufort had a different odor to it. Oh man, it was interesting. But I remember trying to get to the Coast Guard Reserve meeting. Those daggone old shad boats was blocking the way.
That's funny.
I remember the first time I ever went for an airplane ride with someone that was in the reserve with me. Took me for an airplane ride, and I got out of the airplane. I said, pointed to a white Super Cub that was down by the old Tide restaurant, and I said, Johnny, who is that fellow? He said, that's Steve Oakley. I said, who is Steve? He said, he's a fish spotter. I said, what's a fish spotter? That was 1960 probably. Somewhere that it was later than that. Steve had that white Cub. It was new in '64, so it could have been. It had to have been '64 or later, maybe around that time. And I said, "What's a fish spotter?" And I remember when he said that. I remember hearing Jesse Taylor said in the boats in the sign in the summertime. When I'd be waking up mornings at home there at Gloucester, I could hear them talking over a loudspeaker. they didn't have radios. He would hold a loudspeaker out the window.
Is that right?
And talk to them, tell them which way to turn, and I could see him circling. He'd come right over the land the closest to that cub. He flew a cub. He was the one that got hit by the jet from Cherry Point. And his name was Jesse Taylor.
You mean from the airplane he would be talking through a loudspeaker with the window open?
That's right. The first radio that they had was the military radio, and it was so big the airplane would hardly carry it. And they would transmit on one radio and receive on another radio, and they had a reel like a rod and reel has on it up on the top of the airplane, and a cable went out the tail of the airplane, went out the back. It had a cone on it, and it would pull the antenna out so far, and they had a piece of tape on the antenna reel, so when the cable, the little wire came out to a point they was tuned to, they'd stop it by that mark, and that tape on that wire by even that mark, and that was tuning that antenna to that radio. And sometimes they'd land, forget to reel that in, and pull it off. All such stuff as that. They'd have to reel that in after they got through setting the boat.
So, William, did you fly because you wanted to be a fish spotter? Is that why you learned to fly?
I was a plumber for 10 years, and we put in sewer systems and plumbing and run backhoe and trucks and stuff. I ran it for a man in Moorhead, E.G. Phillips, and I got tired of having rainy days in the wintertime. You didn't get much time to work. You couldn't work when it was raining. You couldn't work after it rained because it was wet, and so it was just messy. I got tired, and on Christmas of 1967, 2 weeks before Christmas, I told him I wouldn't be coming back. I was going to do something. I got tired of doing that and crawling our houses, so I said, I'm going to do something else. And I had my eye on maybe become a charter pilot, but no money has ever been made really in the pilots flying charter, or other than the big airlines. The small airlines, they don't make any money. The charter pilot, only the people made the money was the fish spotters and the crop dusters. That was high risk jobs, took a lot of risk, and therefore the pay was pretty good. It was better up north than it was down this way. You had two companies competing against one another, and they would hire pilots out of one company for next year over in their company. If they caught more fish, they thought it was the pilots. Then they'd say the pilots were catching them more fish, you know. But Standard Products was really behind on their nets. They had Zapata or Haney Products had the better nets, but you couldn't tell the same old net man that made the nets for years. The boss man thought he was the greatest, and he could make a pretty net, but it didn't catch fish like the Haney Products.
Huh, really?
It didn't. They'd jump over the corks, and the corks would go down, and that's when Bob would come down here. He got one of those nets from up Reeville, Virginia, up there that some of that crowd that made. And started catching. He had a net there that you couldn't get the fish out of it. It would catch too many. You know, save too many. If it was a bunch of fish, you took it all in, had a lot of fish. You couldn't get rid of it. Hard to get them out of the net. If you got a net that with the corks won't go down, it's hard to get them out. And he come alongside, but he had winches, and he could manage a big set of fish. I've got to take her right.
Okay. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add, William?
No, it's about all I could think of. Plenty more, but it's over a 25 or 30-year period. A lot of things happen.
That's right.
Been a good life, really had.
Okay, well, thank you so much.